I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here, and this is Trish Wood is Critical. It's a show that's foundationally based on critical thinking at a time when nobody is thinking critically anymore except us. We're the only ones left, but we're doing it. And this has been, in my view, a very dark day and dark week, in fact, for critical thinking, because Tucker Carlson, who many of you know and love for all his faults, he has a few, was apparently fired. I've done some work on this for you. I did a special commentary for Premium Substack, and then I wrote a piece on Substack about what I think it actually means. And then Megyn Kelly, who had been a big star at Fox, reported just a couple of days ago that maybe he wasn't fired at all. Maybe they've just pulled him off the air, and that his contractual situation is not resolved. Who knows? The bottom line is that Tucker has been deplatformed. And that means quite a lot right now because no explanation really fits what happened to Tucker, except that clearly somebody does not want him doing his razor-sharp analysis and commentary during the election that's coming up. He's too dangerous for them, and he's dangerous because he can walk both sides of the street. He can speak to Kara Dansky, who is a feminist, about trans extremism. He can speak to Naomi Wolf, also a lefty, about the tyranny of COVID policy. He has appeal on both sides of the aisle, despite all of the crazy hair on fire commentary from the left, and also from people who don't watch the show. People who watch the show are much less critical than people who don't, as with most things in life. That was, it was such a habit in this household. 8 o'clock, I would go and sit in front of the TV, and I would kind of schedule things in my life around that to a degree, obviously. And then my best girlfriend and I would talk in the morning about what Tucker's monologue had been the night before. So it's been a real change. And I did find myself wandering aimlessly in front of the TV a couple of nights. But Brian Kilmeade has been filling in, which is an insult in a way to the memory of Tucker. I hear he's a very, very nice guy, but he can't carry Tucker's briefcase. Tucker is a very, very well-educated, very deep thinker and fearless analyst. And Brian Kilmeade may be a nice guy, but he's not filling the shoes. And what's interesting about my reaction to Brian Kilmeade, and probably anybody else in that chair, is that he doesn't seem capable of capturing the complicated and dangerous moment that we live in his commentary. And I think it's because he hasn't noticed it. And so it's become harder and harder for me to pay attention to alleged news people. I use the term very loosely, and commentators who don't fully grasp what's happened to us all. So that's a real loss. I don't know what Megyn was actually saying. I listened to her commentary about it, and I guess there's some ongoing stuff. The word on the street is that they just want to keep him quiet and that they'll pay him to stay quiet. I can't imagine Tucker Carlson going along with that, especially right now. Rumble, I'm sure, is knocking at the door. He would be a great fit for Rumble. And there are a lot of other kind of cable-y news places like OWN and other places who are, I'm sure, throwing bags of cash at him. But I'm sure he doesn't need the money either. And he never seems really to have been motivated by money. So we'll see where he ends up. I suspect it'll be a free speech platform like Rumble, and he'll be making $100 million a year like Joe Rogan, and everybody will be happy. What's interesting about where he goes is if he goes to a non-cable TV place like Rumble or starts his own channel or whatever he does, because of his demographic, it's actually very bad for cable TV, because I'm sure that people in his demographic, many of them are, or some of them at least, are like over 60. And some of those people, perhaps many of those people, have not cut the cable cord yet and are not comfortable streaming shows like Tucker's from the internet in that way. But their commitment to Tucker will move them that way. So this, I think, is going to have bigger ramifications, if in fact that's what he does, than any of them thought of. And it's also, in my view, an insult to his viewers that they think that they can just blow up somebody that talented and we won't notice, and they'll parachute someone else in. It's just a time slot. People only care about the time slot. That's not true. And actually the ratings show that. Nothing against Brown Kimmead, but the ratings show, I think he was down almost by half. And there's just no reason to watch it. There's no, I don't watch Fox News at all in the evenings anymore. So, but that's just me. Maybe other people are. So we'll see. I'm sure he'll make a comeback. It's who he is. It's what he does. He doesn't want to be on the sidelines. And I saw a lovely photograph of Tucker and his wife, Susan, in a golf cart in Florida near their home there, smiling and laughing and joking on their way out to dinner. And I thought, wow, that's something for us to all shoot for, isn't it? He's had this huge crisis in his life, professionally, I guess, and he was apparently shocked when it happened. And yet, in the presence of his wife, with whom he has been married for 31 years, high school sweetheart, I think they got married in college, and you do not hear about Tucker Carlson the kind of bad behavior rumors that you do about other rich, famous news people. I think he's a pretty good husband. And I think she's a pretty good wife. And the most telling thing about Tucker for me is that he lets the dog sleep on the bed. At one point on one of the shows, he said that they have 4 dogs sleeping on the bed, which I think is hilarious, because my wonderful husband was not a dog person until we met. And now he sleeps with a dog in the bed, which he never would have even considered before we met. But now he's a dog person. So, and dog people are good people. We all know that. So that's another nice thing to say about Tucker, although I am somewhat bereft, and I'm sure many of you are too. So what are we going to do about that today? Well, we are going to talk to our first guest coming up, and that is the one and only Victor Hanson, who was one of Tucker's, especially back in the early days of his 8 o'clock time slot. Professor Hanson was one of Tucker's most frequent guests. And I actually haven't talked to him about what he thinks about it. I just booked the interview because I'll take him on anything. I think he's so smart. So we've got him coming up. I haven't recorded it yet. I'm going to record it later today and we'll edit it in. But he's coming up. He'll be our number one interview about Tucker and other things in America right now. Without Tucker, there are not a lot of populist voices. And some of the voices who claim to be populist maybe are not that bright. So it's a real loss. It's a real loss. Dan Bongino has also gone from Fox. And there is talk that Maria Bartiromo might be in trouble. There is some talk about other hosts who were talking about the Dominion voting machines and this big settlement they just made. Massive settlement, actually, almost $1 billion. Very interesting and they originally said Tucker was gone over Dominion, but that's garbage, because if you go to my Substack, Trish Wood is Critical on Substack, in the piece I wrote about Tucker, you'll see there's a piece of tape they don't want you to see, which is Tucker being mad that Sidney Powell would not produce the evidence that would back up her claims about Dominion voting machines. They had a fight about it, and she wouldn't come on the show because Tucker was demanding, as journalists do, some evidence for the claims she was making. So of all people to be let go over the settlement, we're not buying it. It's not true. So if in fact he was let go, and I believe he was, but maybe there's still some contractual things to work out there, he was not the right He was not the right scapegoat for the Dominion voting problem. And I do want to say this about Dominion voting lawsuit as well, and all of the journalists who were cheering it on because they hate Fox so much. The winning of a libel action against a media company, even if you hate the media company, is not a good look. It's bad for everybody, because in America right now, and in the Democratic side of things particularly, they're using something called lawfare, and that is the use of the courts, both criminally and also civilly, to harass and attack their opponents. And here's what I mean by that. The Dominion lawsuit may or may not actually have been about libel, but it certainly was filed to shut people up. And that's what it does. It stops, that's why it's called libel chill. It stops people from commenting about something because they're afraid they're going to be sued. And what's been happening in DC and in Canada around the Freedom Convoy a little bit too, a lot of these charges are dropped, and maybe they're not going to hold up in court, but there's litigation going on. And it means that the target of the so-called lawfare, always political, is going to have to expend time and resources defending themselves. That is the point of it. They don't even necessarily know that they have a winnable outcome coming down the pike, but they tie people up with these lawsuits. That's what they do. They bankrupt them. That's the point. They're trying to scare them. So that more and more is now being used as a political tool. And of course, we saw that in the criminal code, the criminal courts around Donald Trump too, and Alan Bragg and that criminal case, which everybody says doesn't have a leg to stand on. I believe that, actually. And what that means, though, is that Trump is expending all of this money to defend himself. I don't think he's as rich as he wants us to think he is. He's wasting time flying back and forth. And then they also get the political sauce of seeing him in a courtroom having to defend himself against a charge, even though it's highly, highly unlikely that it's going to be victorious for the Democrats and their very special prosecutor. I don't mean he's a special prosecutor. I mean a prosecutor who's special to the Democrats, Alvin Bragg. So that's what this is about. Hold that thought in your head and watch how it unfolds over the next few years. It's become a big tactic, and it works. People just don't want to get involved in things in case they get sued and have to spend, their mortgage their house in order to pay for it. And as someone myself, I was sued twice over one story. I was indemnified by the CBC, thank goodness I was, but I will tell you, it's not an experience you ever want to go through. It's a very, very, very difficult experience. And Mike Wallace, I might have told you this. I think I played a tape of him talking about it way, way back in the day. But Mike Wallace was suicidal when he was sued for libel by General William Westmoreland about something that Mike Wallace said about the Vietnam War. It's very, very difficult. It's a cruel and hideous process. And Washington elites have figured out that this is a good way to silence people. And I fear it may come to Canada too, that we may have to struggle through some of this garbage. But keep your eyes peeled. The other lawfare element regarding Tucker Carlson is this woman who was fired and has now come forward claiming all of these manner of things that are it's kind of frat housey stuff, I think. None of it was particularly off-putting for me. I mean, you can go into any workplace and cherry pick stuff and say, oh, the man said this and the man said that. But, newsrooms are like that. Grow a pair and just go back to work and be quiet. But she's portraying herself as this big heroine and making her case against Tucker Carlson's staff. Ironically, even though this is being brought up in the context of him being fired by Fox, he never even met this woman. Tucker never met her. He was already working in Florida. So I don't know how this goes badly against him, but I think people were saying bad words, and there was that terrible photograph of Nancy Pelosi in the one-piece bikini with her chest hanging out. It's kind of an odd and funny picture. I wouldn't have been offended to see that as a woman in a newsroom. It's a silly picture. She shouldn't be dressing that way on the beach for one thing, but anyway. So that was one of the things she complained about. How much more small could it be? But of course, she's being trotted around the way that the Democratic sympathetic legacy media are, as if she's some great heroine. So we'll have to endure that. But I don't think she's going to go too far with it. And she's sure not going to go too far in the news business if she's that sensitive either. That's like, and also, who hired her anyway? Once I heard her talking, I thought, who would hire this person for a newsroom? Anyway, so that's that. So our first guest is Victor Hanson from California. So thrilled to have him. And then our second guest is also so interesting. His name is Jose Vega. And Jose Vega is a guy who calls himself a disruptor. He's been going around to certain events to do the aggressive work that legacy media is not doing. I'm sure if you're on Twitter, you've seen some of his videos. They get millions of views. And his latest one is from Columbia Journalism School. Oh my God, it's this august place, the kind of center of journalism in America right now. And it was some kind of a meeting with an audience. The New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Reuters, their executive editors were all there. What brain power on the stage they had. And Jose is really mad. Jose is mad because they aren't actually covering news. They lie about things. They make mistakes about things. They BS us into misbegotten wars, don't they? So what he does, and it's brilliant, he kind of crashes these things. And then he gets up and he starts asking from the audience these very, very aggressive questions of the people on the stage. And you know what? It's great because it embarrasses them. He calls them out the way legacy media occasionally in the past used to call people out. And these are wonderful things to behold because psychosocially you can see them, they're kind of embarrassed. And the people in the audience are kind of embarrassed because, listen, Jose is speaking truth. He's speaking truth. So we are going to have a nice interview with him. By nice, I mean entertaining. And I'm going to play the tape of his latest disruptive event at Columbia School of Journalism, but I'll play that just before we go to him in the second interview that we do today. So the other thing I'm going to say about media today, we got two interviews about media, Tucker Carlson and then Jose Vega, who's disrupting all of these old dinosaurs who refuse to report the truth, is that Bill C-11 did pass. It's the online streaming bill that all the digital creators like myself are kind of worried about. Like a lot of these bills that are passed here and in the States, it's unclear what it's even supposed to do, but it's not a good look because it's going to be more censorship and more regulation of creators. And as the information gap grows between politicians and the people they govern. In other words, they're lying more, they're being called out less by legacy media, and you know what? They like it that way. They like it that way. So they see indie media, digital creators, as we're called in this bill, as a threat. And every analysis I've read of this bill, albeit it's under the guise of CanCon, transfers money from us back to legacy media. Legacy media is failing. I believe that Bill C-11 is a sop by the government to legacy media who protect the government. That's my opinion. I have no evidence for that. It's just my analysis. But this is very dangerous, and we shall see when the CRTC, who are going to be regulating our content, get their mitts on this, what that actually means. This is very bad. Canada is a frightening place to many, many people I speak to from outside the country. They're like, what the hell is going on over there? And I can't explain it. And what I will say about it is that our true nature was exposed during COVID-19, wasn't it? We are much more regulatory friendly. We want to hand stuff over to the managerial class so we don't have to think too much. That's apparently who we are. People should be in the streets about Bill C-11. And I will say a mea culpa of my own. I've been following Bill C-11 kind of peripherally, even though it was really important. I was so bogged down in COVID that I was sort of laid off the mark being critical of it. I spoke to Rupa Subramanya about it last week in our interview we did for her podcast, but I have dropped the ball here myself. And part of it was just that reading about it in legacy media was so convoluted, I couldn't actually figure it out. This is the other thing that happens, right? They make the bill so long and so complicated, people just get bored and give up talking about it. I think that's quite deliberate, by the way. I do. So we have to watch this. Let me just read. This is maybe CTV's analysis. Bill C-11 is aimed at ensuring increasingly popular and profitable social media platforms and streaming services such as Netflix, Crave, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Disney, and YouTube are subjected to Canadian content requirements and regulations comparable to traditional broadcasters. So the policy change comes with a requirement for these platforms to spend millions investing in Canadian content and creators. Oh, so this is really scary. So we'll see what happens there. I'll keep you abreast of it. And it actually might be something that will change how you vote in the next federal election because we need to get it repealed, right? Okay, so I'm going to do my pitch now. And my pitch is that Trish Wood is Critical is a podcast, and it is a Substack where I crank out a piece a week, sometimes less, sometimes more, but we're on Substack primarily because it's a funding platform that is about free speech, and that's important to me. So anybody from Patreon or PayPal who has not moved over, you should when you can. I would really appreciate it because that's where all the fun's happening. There's a lot of good discussion going on. And what I'm going to start doing is posting the weekly podcast there too. So if you want to have a discussion about something on the podcast, you can do that in the comments chain on Substack. My Twitter, which you should be on too, because I promote a lot of stuff there, you can find it, is @WoodReporting, @WoodReporting on Twitter there. So we also have a website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. And there's a merch store with fun things in there as well. And a little bit more about me. If you don't know, I was a legacy media journalist at CBC's The Fifth Estate for almost 10 years. Big background in investigative reporting, and started this podcast primarily because I knew in March of 2020, COVID-19 was going to be, from a public policy perspective, a huge disaster as a former science reporter. So I started the podcast, and the rest is history, as they say. And all you lovely people have come along for the ride, and that's very, very satisfying for me. So let's talk about a couple things that happened this week. One of them was a media event that our Prime Minister held, in which he said in the most offhanded way 2 insane things. He says a lot of insane things, but these were insane. He said he never forced anybody to get the vaccine, but it's kind of like Bill Clinton and asking what is the meaning of sex, or whatever that thing he did during the Monica Lewinsky thing. What is the meaning of force, Mr. Prime Minister? You take away jobs, you take away people's ability to travel, to see relatives, in some cases even to get surgery. You poisoned the well so badly. I was afraid even to let my husband go to hospital for something because I was afraid they would. I mean, it was terrible. This was a terrible, terrible thing. So he's not saying, well, I didn't force anybody. So he would probably say I didn't hold anybody down, but he did everything else. And let's not forget, he wouldn't even talk to the trucker convoy about mandates. So he's just, when somebody is prepared to lie and gaslight in that way, we have got to put our suits of armor on, because not only is he trying to save his own rear, but those kind of comments are really hard on us cognitively. They hurt the country because we know he's lying. We heard what he said before. So we've got to really be prepared for what's coming at us now. I think a lot of people who screwed up terribly, terribly badly, including Tony Fauci, and also the Randy Weingarten, the teachers union president. She's also backtracking like mad. Wow, it's just incredible, isn't it? People, how, but we're not letting them off the hook. None of them. We're not doing that. So let me just play this clip for you, if you haven't heard it already, of Prime Minister Trudeau dissembling and backtracking and gaslighting and all the stuff he does.
Like any modern bit of medical advancements, there are potential side effects in vaccinations. And there are people who've probably gotten very sick from vaccinations, on the billions of people who've been vaccinated against COVID over the past few years.
There's so much wrong with that. I don't know where to begin, but he was the one chanting safe and effective, as was Theresa Tam and everybody in the Liberal government and all of the media. None of them recognizing for a second the vaccine injured. Well, he calls them side effects. They're not side effects. These people are vaccine injured, and it's not just a question of having a headache or a sore arm. People died as a result of these shots. No one disputes that. Only fools and gangsters dispute that now. So he's opened the door to truth a little. He's poking his little toe out through the door, starting to say what we've all known from the beginning. And here is the thing. If he's going to say that, we must do what we must do with all of these people. The reason people were vaccine hesitant was because the product was not tested long enough to give us good long-term data on safety and effectiveness. Full stop. That's why I didn't get the shot. That's exactly why I didn't get it. And the people who said no were called all manner of terrible things. I don't need to go into them again. We've heard them enough. I'm not going to pollute your life by repeating all of the awful things this man said. And he said those things against people who had a legitimate reason for being nervous about taking the shot, the so-called side effects that he's now finally admitting. And is he so dumb he doesn't understand? I know that disrespects the office of the Prime Minister when I say that, but forgive me. I sort of mean it. Is he so dumb that he does not understand the risk-benefit calculation here? For people who had no risk of dying of COVID-19, and those people exist, in fact, that's the majority of people, why should they take their chance on a shot? Why were you mandating a shot? Why were you screaming that the shot was safe and effective? Why were you demonizing people who didn't want it? Just awful, awful, awful. We are not governed by serious people, folks. We are not. The other thing I just want to stop and have a little visit with is a piece of tape that involves Bobby Kennedy. And it's quite interesting. He gave what they are saying is the first media interview after he declares his candidacy in the Democratic primary to be the candidate to run for president. So there's a lot of good stuff about Bobby Kennedy for sure. And he's interviewed on ABC News by a young woman named Lindsay Davis. And the most extraordinary thing happened. She runs this interview with Bobby, and then at the end of it, she comes on and she says this. Listen carefully.
Let's try to take a news path that will allow us to give our children a country that is, once again, a moral authority around the globe, an exemplary nation, and that has a booming middle class in this country that can sustain democracy.
We should note that during our conversation, Kennedy made false claims about the COVID-19 vaccines. Data shows that the COVID-19 vaccines prevented millions of hospitalizations and deaths from the disease. He also made misleading claims about the relationship between vaccination and autism. Research shows that vaccines and the ingredients used for the vaccines do not cause autism, including multiple studies involving more than 1 million children and major medical associations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the advocacy group Autism Speaks. We've used our editorial judgment in not including extended portions of that exchange in our interview. We thank Mr. Kennedy for the conversation.
Wow. I've never seen anything like that done in the news business. And she must be getting a mighty, mighty, mighty big paycheck in order to do something that is, I mean, it's heresy, actually. So what happened here? A good journalist, somebody who wasn't just operating as the comms department for the elites, would have done her research and taken Bobby on about COVID vaccines and about autism and vaccines. If it's so clear to her, and she's seen all of these studies that show that he's full of it, then her role as the journalist is not to excise what he said and cowardly slink away. It's to take him on with the studies. That's what you do. You don't do that. I mean, I nearly fell off my chair. I don't know about the autism thing. I in 2000, I think, and 3, I worked with some journalists who actually, I wasn't reporting with them, but they were reporting on it, and they believed that there was a link. Debunked, I don't know. I have no opinion on anything anymore that I haven't personally investigated. But certainly the claims, I'm sure the claims Bobby made about the COVID vaccine were absolutely true. And she didn't have to really do too much research to go there. And if she did have the research to say he was wrong, she should have debated him about it, right? But she didn't do that. What did she do? She cut him out, or somebody cut him out. And then she does this pathetic little confession at the end, reading. I mean, I feel like I'm in the Soviet Union. I really do. It's like Pravda. We can't say that. We can't let someone say something, I mean, even if Bobby is dead wrong about autism and vaccines, why can't he say it? Let people figure it out. Do the research, read, figure out what the debunking means. Clearly, everything now is kind of off the table for definitive statements because we've learned how much they lie to us more in science, right? More than ever during this particular time. So, wow, that was really, really shocking to me. So coming up right now, in fact, is an interview with the one and only frequent Tucker Carlson guest, historian, big thinker with the Hoover Institution at Stanford, one of my favorite public intellectuals, Victor Davis Hanson. Professor Hanson, I guess where I want to start with you today really is asking about the shock firing, I guess, of Tucker Carlson this week. I was pretty taken aback by it. Were you? And what do you think happened? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think everybody was upset because he had the largest audience, not only at Fox, but he had a larger audience than his competitors at CNN and MSNBC combined by a magnitude, I think, of 2 or 3. So everybody wanted to know why a network would do that, especially because he became kind of iconic among the conservative movement. Yeah. And then in the last 5 days, there's been all of these different narratives. I don't think the narrative that he criticized, that he was unduly conspiratorial about January 6th, they may not have liked him showing some videos of the actual tapes of the entrance into the Capitol, but there were other people who had actually been on the air who had doubted the validity of the Dominion voting machines that led to that huge $757 million settlement. But one of them was not Tucker. So then people thought, well, what was it? And then there were these 2 lawsuits that were impending, one against a producer who alleged a climate of sexism, even though that she'd never met him. He's never seen her face to face. And then the other lawsuit about a computer voting machine, who knows? But I think by the end of the week, the narratives had coalesced that in private conversations, like we all do when we trade emails back and forth, he had been very critical of the Murdoch family and Fox hierarchy. And I think they finally felt, well, he's controversial. People in our cultural milieu don't like him. We get a lot of criticism about him. And now he's criticizing us, so we're going to cut him loose. And I think it was made again, this is just speculation on what people have told me off the record, but believe it or not, you get the impression it was made kind of impromptu over the weekend or just literally hours before he got to work or when he was at work Monday, ready to go into the show that evening. So it may have been something that was quite a part of emotion or anger, but whatever it is, the replacement, who's a very good guy, Brian Kilmeade, I mean, he has about half the audience.
Yeah.
And so Fox, and it's very strange what's going on. The left wing is applauding Fox for the first time in my memory. And I've never seen that before, that they finally are doing what the left wanted. And of course, it's kind of Orwellian, because right when this story is going on, we have this Russian disinformation story where a former interim head of the CIA, Mr. Morrell, was called by Joe Biden's chief campaign strategist, now the Secretary of State, to round up 50 ex-intelligence officers, basically to lie and say that this authentic laptop, which was in the FBI possession, was actually Russian disinformation, which no one believed at the time, but which the FBI suppressed information about it on Twitter and Facebook, apparently. But more importantly, a whole pantheon of network news, PBS, NPR, cable news journalists, night after night after night, looked the audience in the eye and said, this is Russian disinformation. And there was no consequences, but that was something that happened before the election.
Yeah.
And according to one poll, it had a determinate effect on the outcome in the sense of the dominion, whatever one thinks about the merits of that case. No one says it affected an election. It was something that came afterwards, the controversy. So I think people look at all of these things and they're still bewildered, and they haven't been given an explanation. We got more of an explanation from Fox about the departure of Chris Wallace, who had 0 ratings, than we did Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, he is a guy that I think one could reliably say is an aristocratic populist, right? And also,
yes,
he's quite well educated. He when he marshals the arguments for one of his monologues, he's really done a lot of kind of deep research and thinking about it. It's not just kind of boilerplate, angry conservatism. They're really thoughtful, and I feel that maybe that's dangerous today. I mean, there's no one else really doing what he was doing.
No, there were about 2 or 3 red lines that he broke in the bipartisan protocol. The first, of course, was he brought guests on that questioned the efficacy of the vaccinations, and the argument they made very early on was that the Moderna and Pfizer messenger RNA vaccinations would not prevent infectiousness or being infected. And then secondly, they had some side effects in younger men especially. And that turned out to be true.
Yeah.
But he was severely criticized. The second thing that he did was on matters of race. He was very blunt, and he told the truth. He said that African-American males are inordinately represented in crimes of violence, and basically 12% of the population, smaller when you factor in gender, maybe 3 or 4 to 5%, were committing 50% of all the violent crime. He didn't want to analyze it. He didn't want to get into the reasons why. He just gave a fact. No one disputed that fact, but they got very angry when he showed clips of smash and grab or break-ins or looting and that got people angry. And the third, of course, was he said that the Capitol demonstration on January 6th had a lot of FBI informants in the crowd, and that the only person who was killed violently, contrary to what Joe Biden and Hakeem Jeffries said, they said 5 people died there violently, was Ashley Babbitt, who was shot while unarmed by breaking into a window and committing probably a misdemeanor. And then he said, in addition, very controversially, when that happens in America, when a police officer shoots an unarmed suspect lethally, that officer's identification is plastered all over the newspapers. And this particular officer had his identity suppressed for almost 4 or 5 months. And so those are the things that I think the left targeted him for, and the advertisers. So that was another thing that's not mentioned, that a lot of the advertisers looking at those issues said, if we put our product in commercials during that hour, we're going to get boycotted by the left or the center or something. So they pulled out the advertising revenue.
I think that one of the things he did, especially in responding to the list that you just gave, is that he made it clear to the country and to the viewers that we kind of exist in a post-truth world. The failure of legacy media has created a landscape in which we cannot trust things that are said at all anymore within the political sphere. Do you agree with that, Professor Hanson?
Yeah, I do. And I didn't agree with him on some issues, but I did agree almost on the entire thematic narrative of his show, which is, I'm going to tell you what the truth is as I see it. I'm not going to, attack other people. I'm going to bring on controversial guests, some of whom will not agree with me, but I'm going to tell you a narrative that I think is correct, no matter whether it's unpopular or not. Mm-hmm. So what ties all of those narratives together is that no one else would talk about them, and he did. And that could be sometimes the mundane about unexplained, unidentified flying objects. He would bring on experts, and they were experts sometimes. Yeah. And sometimes they were baffled. No other person would do that. And by the same token, he was very critical, as critical of what I would call the corporate Republican elite in what the Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney profile than he was left-wing Democrats. By that, I mean he would bring on a Glenn Greenwald or Robert Kennedy Jr. or Tulsi Gabbard and have more affinities, at least on the air, with them than he would a Mitt Romney or someone of that caliber. So I think the Republican elite, the corporate elite, did not like him. And one of them, of course, was Paul Ryan, is on the board of News Corp. So there was a lot of pushback from not just the left, but the doctrinaire establishment, corporate right.
Well, what you're describing about him is almost quaint in a sense, looking back on the way that shows like that were curated. A certain host would have people on that they didn't agree with. He didn't always have to agree on everything. Democrats would interview Republicans and vice versa. Everything is so siloed now that what he did on that show felt even a bit revolutionary. I remember the night he had Naomi Wolf on talking about the tyranny of the COVID restrictions, and I thought, wow, he's interviewing a left-wing feminist. And I thought, I was kind of jumping up and down and thinking how wonderful it was that he had her on.
He had no restrictions on ideology or party affiliations. And then the other thing that was different about him was he, as you mentioned, he was a child of the aristocracy. His mother, I think his stepmother, was the heir to the Swanson food fortune, and his grandfather, and I'm speaking as a farmer, a person who lives on a farm in Central California, was the largest landowner in California in the 19th century. The Miller Lux Land Company is famous still for a big cattle and ranching company. So he grew up in prep schools and in very affluent neighborhoods, and yet he was very candid about it, and he was very critical of that class, and he became a champion of the middle class populism. And he wasn't just a MAGA person. He, as you saw from his uncensored text, he was very critical of Donald Trump. He could be very favorable at times, but he wasn't just, his show didn't become a megaphone for Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that Tucker saw Trump as somewhat oafish, right, which he kind of is at times. But you can still admire the fact that he was really good on some populist issues. And I think that's where Tucker found him a very interesting candidate. I want to just move on because now we have limited time, but I'm desperate to talk to you about the upcoming race. David Brooks, have you read David Brooks' piece in the New York Times today? It's just.
I don't know if I have. I read a couple of them in the last 3 or 4 days. Which one was this?
Well, this is just. It's maybe the worst thing I've seen in a very long time. He's talking about how a vote for Biden is a vote for a returning to morality in the presidency, which I mean, I almost couldn't get through it. It was so bad. But his last graph is the contest between Biden and Trumpism is less Democrat versus Republican or liberal versus conservative than it is between an essentially moral vision and an essentially amoral one, a contest between decency and its opposite. I mean, is he describing the same Biden I've been watching for the last couple? Man,
where to start? I mean, this could only be written by someone who's a bi-coastal elite that's completely isolated from the realities or the consequences of what Joe Biden's done. I live in a community that's 95% Mexican American, and believe me, when you let in 6.5 million illegal aliens and you bus them to communities, mostly Hispanic, that are second and third generation, and you look at what happens to the kidney dialysis kit, the emergency room, all of the social services are swamped. The crime rates go up because people are not vetted when they come in. And there's utter disdain for the consequences of that policy. And the same thing about leaving thousands of loyal Afghans in the Afghanistan pullout, or hundreds of Americans that were left there. You should see what happened in California to the poor when the price of gasoline, deliberately so, because we voluntarily cut back 3 to 4 million barrels, went from, when he came into office, Joe Biden, it was about $3 here, but it got up, it's now $5.50. And a lot of poor people can't. So his policies, whether we talk about inflation or smash and grab, carjackings, or the exorbitant crime rate, or the border, have fallen disproportionately on the lower middle classes and poor people in a very heartless way. When you look what he's said as president, he talks about morality. This is a president that said to an African-American journalist, "You ain't black." And to another one, he said, "You're a junkie." And to 2 African-American subordinates on different occasions, he said, "Hey, boy, my boy."
Yeah.
So he doesn't have a good record on race. And then he divided the country by demonizing half of them. During the campaign, he'd called people who opposed him as dregs and chumps. But when he was president, he started into this strange semi-fascist, ultra-mega insurrectionary. He really tried to demonize half the country. And this is all about, and when he talks about morality, I can't think of any administration since the Harding administration, the Teapot Dome scandal, where there's been more evidence that this family, this consortium, Mr. Big Guy, Mr. 10%, who's referenced on the laptop, has leveraged foreign governments for their own personal profit. And they're all under investigation. I don't know what David Brooks is talking about, other than characteristically, he doesn't seem to have much knowledge of what middle-class people go through every day.
I believe that this kind of division, not just in politics, but in consumed information, is very, very bad for the country. And I don't just mean the country's existence, but I mean the people cognitively. I mean, I feel like there's a sense of cognitive dissonance around how we live now, because my neighbor consumes different media than I do, and they have a completely different view of the world than I do, and we don't like each other over it. And it's almost now, I was saying this the other day to somebody, that people on the other side don't even seem to want facts, right? They're comfortable with the way they think about the world, and talking to them about facts that might change their mind is unwanted and uncomfortable. And I'm wondering how we got here, and I guess where you think in the end America is. And when I say we, obviously, I mean, I'm in Canada, so I'm talking about Western governments, but you guys have an election coming up. And I'm wondering, is this a sign of decadence, of collapse somehow, of the idea of a democracy? Are we seeing the end of something here?
We're seeing the end of something, but I think the causation is pretty clear, that around the millennium, when we embraced globalization, there were particular subsets of the American workforce that had skills that could be translated globally. And then suddenly they had markets of not 300 million, but 6 or 7 billion. And I'm talking specifically about high tech, media, entertainment, insurance, transnational corporations. And they made the amount of money that has never been seen in the history of civilization. Where I work at Stanford University, there's $9 trillion in market capitalization within a 20-mile radius. Facebook, Apple, Google, etc. And what happened was, I think people then convinced themselves, this bi-coastal elite, the one on the west looking at the emerging riches of Asia, the one on the right at the EU, that they were citizens of the world and that they had figured out that there was sort of a utopian existence with all this global wealth, and that they could now concentrate not on keeping warm or being clothed or keeping alive, but on utopian questions, the Green New Deal or transgenderism or racial politics. And what happened was a couple of things. The first is they demonized people who were muscular, who didn't have the skills to compete in the global workplace. So if you worked on an assembly line, or you were a small farmer, or you were a carpenter or something, your wages in the middle class stagnated. And people said, well, why don't you? I remember Joe Biden said when he wanted to close down coal miners, he said, why don't you go learn to code?
Yeah.
And so that was one thing that happened. The other was we had a switch in the parties in matters of wealth. If you look at the zip codes or the congressional districts by per capita income, they all vote consistently 60 to 70% progressively or left wing. That wasn't true 50 years ago. The Republican Party then also flipped to sort of a populist middle class traditional party, and the left became the party of the very, very wealthy. We saw that in the election with Mark Zuckerberg, who infused $419 million himself, and then the very subsidized poor. And then the final thing was, we always in this country worried about class. In other words, we were always worried about the middle class, and people were defined as either needy or not needy based on their income mostly. And yet what the Democratic Party did was they divorced themselves from that concern, and they embraced race on the theory that race was immutable. And so you got kind of but at the same time they did that, race was no longer a proper barometer of income. So you had Asian Americans, for example, with much higher incomes than so-called white Americans, or you had Black Americans making the greatest inroads, where 50% entered the middle class. But when you do that, then you say America's an upwardly mobile society, and it's hard to find a permanently exploited class in Marxist terms. So what they did was they just sort of forgot the lunch bucket group or the union middle class, and they, it was all race, identity politics. And we ended up with these absurdities, and this is getting back to, I think, what Tucker tried to point out, that LeBron James or Oprah Winfrey or Meghan Markle are victims by virtue of their skin color, or that you have graduations of these very privileged kids at some of the most Tony universities in the United States that insist on segregated dorms by race, or segregated graduation by race, or segregated workshops and spaces, and the Democratic and left pushed that. So there were a lot of fundamental changes that I think came ultimately as a result of enormous amounts of wealth that were created on our two coasts. And you can really see that in the red-blue map. About 45% of the population lives between Seattle and San Diego and, New York and Miami. But when you redo the red-blue for area and population, then it's just a population-wise, there's just a balloon that comes out of the two coasts. Balloons come out, but when you do it by area, 90% of the country is red. So this is kind of scary, because we have a geographical force multiplier like we did in the 1850s with the Mason-Dixon line, that people who are conservative are living in a particular place under a particular protocol, a red state governance, and people who are very wealthy or very poor or living in the big cities or the affluent places where the universities and the money is, and the media on the coast, and they don't have much in common, and people are self-segregating because the blue state model doesn't work for big cities. And they're being, I mean, here in California, 500,000 people have left the last 18 months. And they're not going to New York or Minnesota. They're going to Florida and Texas and places, Wyoming and places like that.
Yeah. It's interesting that what is attending all of the things that you talk about is what feels like an absence of the ability to feel shame about the way people behave in their personal lives. So we have this push. It's not just for Drag Queen Story Hour, but there are people who don't think it's uncomfortable that they perform in a sexual way before children, right? Or there is this move now that's attached to the trans movement that includes all these kind of strange fetishes that are paraded out and about. And I feel like it's all kind of morally falling apart. And yet I also feel super old for feeling that way. People are like, well, what, everybody can be free. And I'm like, I don't think this works well. I don't think it's going to do anything for us as a culture.
Well, we don't have any absolutes anymore. And that started in the 60s cultural kind of Maoist revolution. Everything is relative. And then as we became more leisured and affluent, the emphasis was, and social media became more narcissistic, that you had a right and you had the financial ability to engage in any kind of conduct you wish, and you could justify it not by traditional morality or amorality, but by your own sense of victim status. So if the transgendered movement goes into Stanford University, and that was what sparked that driving a judge out and not letting him speak, or issues that, you can't speak of. We had a speaker at San Francisco State here in California that was almost attacked physically. She was shut in a room.
Riley Gaines.
And we could multiply those examples. But the point is that when you do things that are illegal or unlawful or amoral, then you have to justify them under this new protocol. You justify your behavior by the fact that you're a victim. You're a victim. So we had 120 days of writing in 2020 from June to election time. It was $3 billion in damage. 14,000 people were arrested, most of them let go, 35 killed. And it was horrible, arson, and yet it was justified by the vice president. Said it's not going to stop, it shouldn't stop. We had the founder of the 1619 Project who said that looting is not a crime. And why did they say that? And what was their argument? The argument was that the people were victims, and therefore, if you're a victim, then you can excuse any type of behavior. Any means are necessary to achieve parity or equity. And sometimes it becomes absurd because in the United States is a pretty liberal place, and there's far too many would-be victimized than there are sufficient victimizers. So you end up with this epidemic of things like Juicy Smollett or Meghan Markle and Prince Harry at their Montecito mansion, complaining to Oprah at her Montecito mansion that someone said something that was untoward in the royal family. When you look at the cosmic nature of things, that's just insignificant. But it's the search for victimhood, and I think that then excuses any type of behavior. And you can really see it. Unfortunately, I work on a campus and I can see it all the time. And so if you have Ben Shapiro coming to Stanford University and the marginalized community puts posters that say, "Ben be gone," with a picture of Raid, insecticide, with a deliberate echo of Zygon B that killed Jews under the Third Reich, then you would think that the university would punish those people, but they didn't. And the point was that they said they felt victimized by his very presence. They didn't feel, quote unquote, safe. And so I think that's sort of a pathology that's going through the entire Western experience in Europe and North America and the former British Commonwealth, that we reached a level of leisure and affluence where people had the ability and the desire to concentrate on certain things. And one of the ways you push your position is to try to find in a very safe, affluent society some type of victimhood. And it can be racial, it can be gender, it can be transgender. But it's not so much class anymore, because obviously these people have nothing but contempt for the white working class, as we saw in East Palestine, where they were insulted. And here in North America, California, and the United States, we've developed a whole patois to demonize that group. And started with Barack Obama's clingers. Yeah. Hillary Clinton contributed irredeemable and deplorable. And then Joe Biden sort of trumped that with chumps and, as I said, dregs. Yeah. And no one says anything. But they didn't want to go. No major politician really did want to go to East Palestine. When that toxic fume came up, Pete Buttigieg was giving lectures about the racist foundations of the cloverleaf system and the highway system I know. Of the 1950s. He wouldn't go there for 3 weeks. Yeah. It was, and then he just showed up and he quickly left. So that's something that it's new, that we haven't seen this diminution of class and its replacement by race. And when you do that, you can end up with a lot of absurdities given the riches and leisure of the United States, in which people of all different races enjoy.
Yeah, last question, because I know you're short on time today, but I do want to know just briefly where this is leading, because it does feel like the idea that people who are not thinking the way that people in the progressive movement are going to reach a point where they say, we can't live with this. We can't be governed this way. We can't be forced to accept these things. What is going to happen when the country reaches that point, do you think? Will it split apart?
I think we're reaching that point, and half the country is reacting one of two ways. Half the country in the United States, is either considering or is actually moving away from a community they feel that is non-traditional and woke, so to speak, if I could use that generalization. So they're leaving Chicago, they're leaving Minneapolis, they're leaving Seattle, they're leaving Portland, and they're going to more suburban and rural areas where they can find traditional morality or low taxes or less government intrusion. The other half that are stuck, they have retreated to, I guess I'd call it a monastery of the mind. There's just certain things that they don't like about America, or they feel it's been hijacked by radicals and revolutionaries or Jacobins or Bolsheviks, and they don't want anything to do with it. So there's whole swaths of the American cultural experience that we don't even talk about. I mean, there is no such thing as a Grammy, Tony, Oscar, or Emmy audience anymore. When they put those ceremonies, it used to be iconic events. Nobody watches them. Yeah. The NBA playoffs, to take one example, has about 20% of the playoff audience that it had 30 years ago. Yep. And for all the pomp of the National Football League, it's still 8% lower than it was 10 years ago. And so, and we're looking at a massive drop off in university admissions. It's about 5%, 6% off from just 3 years ago, that people are just saying, you know what, I'm not going to be one of the 1.7 trillion in student loan debt to get that type of non-education. I'm just not going to do it and be harassed. When we look at the military, we're off 15 to 20,000 recruits in the Army alone. And that's entirely because a traditional demographic that from the Mason-Dixon line southward, or rural America, who dies, a rural lower middle class white male dies at double their numbers in the demographic in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. and they don't want to join anymore because they feel when Mark Milley or Lloyd Austin says, I'm going to hunt out white rage or white supremacy or white privilege before Congress, but they don't produce any data to suggest it's epidemic, but they're just virtue signaling in the aftermath of George Floyd, people conclude, I don't want it. My grandfather fought in the Gulf War, or they'll say, my dad fought in Afghanistan, I'm not going to join. And I've heard that almost verbatim from hundreds of people. So I think there's a lot of people who are culturally dropping out from our major institutions. Yeah. That's not good because, we have a fragmented society anyway. We don't have any common civic education or religious experience or a network news that we all can trust, like a Walter Cronkite, center left that people tuned in and wanted to hear him. Yeah. We don't have that. And we're becoming further splintered because the left which does not have 51% of the constituency, but nevertheless on issues like the border or transgenderism or energy or foreign policy or crime, they have a narrative that they're very successfully able to promulgate in social media, the corporate boardroom like Disney or American Airlines, or it can be the traditional media, New York Times, Washington Post, or public NPR, PBS, K through 12, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton. So all of these institutions then kind of publicize and promote and fuel this hard left takeover of the Democratic Party, even though it has no popular support. And yet they have the money and the resources because, as I said earlier, the artifact of globalization. That's where the money is now.
Yeah, we're living through a really wild and, in my opinion, exhausting time. And I'd love to have you back sometime to talk about the election as that draws near. And thank you so much for doing this. I'm really grateful to you. Much appreciated. So that was my conversation with Victor Davis Hanson. I swear to you that I will have him on for a longer interview at some point in the near future. He's been fielding a lot of requests since the news of Tucker broke. And so we were given a nice amount of time, but boy, I want more because he's so smart and he's so thoughtful about the American experience. He's one of the last true intellectuals speaking in America today. I think he's a real national treasure. So let's move on now to another national treasure, or about to become a national treasure, and that is Jose Vega, our disruptor, who is a very, very interesting, he's a young guy from the Bronx who's going around to all of these events hosted by, paid for by, visited by American elites and confronting them. He did one with AOC. That was magnificent. This one involves the Columbia School of Journalism, none other than, and the people sitting on the stage were New York Times, Washington Post, and a few other legacy media news executives who, they sit around and they pat each other on the back and say how great they are and talk about misinformation and disinformation, blah, blah, blah. But they get lots of stuff wrong, including the Russia hoax and virtually every misbegotten war. So he just stands up and calls them out on it. And his videos it's like being at a rock show or something. They're very, very uplifting and enlightening, even though he's quite rude, but in a good way. So here is Jose and his encounter, staged, obviously, at the Columbia School of Journalism event involving 4 of journalism's high mucky mucks, as we say.
Oh, is this the lecture hall with Seymour Hersh? I'm looking for the one with Seymour Hersh because it's a policy and press hall event. So shouldn't we be talking about the Nord Stream since that's the biggest story of the century? And you guys, I'm sorry. I mean, you have the executive editor of the New York Times there who came out with a phony story to try and block Seymour Hersh. It's just kind of funny how that happened, I mean, did you even acknowledge Seymour Hersh? All of you are executive editors of papers that broke Pentagon, My Lai, Watergate. Is this the same papers or not? I mean, is there anything you've gotten right in the last 20 years, or am I mistaken about that? I mean, it's just kind of funny because Iraq, wrong. Syria, wrong. Russiagate, really wrong. Okay, I mean, the list goes on and on. So the last thing you could do to try and actually fix your reputation is acknowledge that through leaks, we had to find out that Zelensky was going to bomb Moscow on the anniversary. I mean, if you're so impartial, shouldn't you at least say, right, that Zelensky was going to bring us on the verge of World War III? That seems pretty fair. While Julian Assange rots in prison, all of you got, fat checks because he's in jail for doing your job. And you know what? Tucker Carlson ain't no Seymour Hersh, but he did something you guys are scared to do. Speak the truth and actually be critical of the war, which is why he was actually fired from Fox, because you are all cowards, every single one of you. None of you have actually had any relevancy. And you know what? The mainstream press is now dying. Nobody's ever going to listen to you again. You have no credibility with the public. The only people who care about what you have to say are elite assholes who have nothing productive to say anymore, and it's dying off. So will you at least say something, either about Nord Stream or Ukraine or the fact that Zelensky brought us to the verge of World War III, and the only reason we knew about that was through leaks? Go ahead. It's a free speech event, right? You guys are the press. Let's say something here. Mr. Khan, come on. You're the executive editor of the New York Times, I'm just trying to get into some good trouble here, man. Woo. Listen, Karen, get out of my face for a second. I got to talk to these gentlemen. Okay. Well, I just want to hear what they have to say. Go ahead. I'm done.
Wait your turn.
I'm telling you. Come.
Wait your turn.
You could project if we can't.
I would just say I think it's important to hear everybody's point of view.
Yeah.
So thank you.
All right.
I do think that we need to give our moderator a chance to ask other questions.
We're on the verge of World War III.
Some of the people in the audience also do so. Thank you. Really, thank you.
Say something about this bombing. We blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Listen, don't stand there while there are people rotting in prison. Nobody said anything about Uhuru, right? The socialists who are in jail for being critical of this war. God damn it.
Let's go.
At least say something about the people in jail for being critical of this war. They don't deserve to be in prison right now.
I love that so much. It's just great. It's it breaks through the torpor. We're so surrounded by bullshit. It's like the speech in the film where he is saying, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore network, right? Howard Beale. That's what it feels like. Every word he said was true. Every word he said was true. This guy is a left progressive and he still thinks Tucker Carlson's a great journalist. That's why Tucker's scary. And that's why those overpaid poodles on the stage sat there quaking in their boots, because this guy, Jose, who's coming up on our show today, was speaking truth. I just want to say, well, you'll hear more about what he was saying about the socialists who were arrested for criticizing the war in Ukraine. He does talk about that, so I don't need to explain it. And it's quite interesting in this interview. I said, gee, you're the kind of guy I thought we'd see on Tucker Carlson's show. And he actually has a very interesting story to tell about that, involving the young woman who is now not credibly accusing Tucker Carlson show of being a terrible place for women to work. So it's very interesting. Anyway, here is my interview with Jose Vega. Hi, Jose. How are you?
I'm as good as you can be.
And where are you, Jose? Down in New York?
I'm in New York City. I'm born and raised in the Bronx, and I'm still in the Bronx, and I love the Bronx.
Yeah, I could never, ever have figured that out from your accent.
Oh.
It's very Bronxian. I guess my first question, and for sure our audience is going to want to know this too, because they will have heard the video. This is audio only, so they would have heard you being tackled. Were you hurt when they made that jump on you?
A little bit, yeah. I had a kind of like a small bruise on my knee, and I fell also on my stomach too. So it was on my knee first, and then I collapsed onto my stomach. But it was okay. It wasn't that big of a deal. But I thought it was funny that it was the Dean of Columbia that was pushing me down and dragging me out, not just the security. Yeah, yeah.
Oh my God! And I didn't know that was at Columbia. Was that under the auspices of the Columbia School of Journalism? That event?
You hit it. You hit the nail right on the head.
Oh God, I just want to die. How much more bad can it be? So before we get into these events that you're doing, which are so fun, and get a very, very solid review from people on Twitter who are so happy to see somebody saying what we all think, tell me who you are. What is your background, and why you're doing this? What are you trying to achieve, if anything in particular?
My name is Jose Vega. My background is that I've been a part of the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization since I was about 14 or 15 years old. I just stumbled upon them because they had, tables all around Manhattan. And so that's kind of what started my political journey and awakening. But even before that, what it was reading Plato and also understanding classical art and classical culture, because a lot of it is about what is the human mind, what is the human soul, and why is it that we are the way we are? What is a human being? And so I think Plato's Republic goes through a lot of what is the best way to form a government that can best shape a human being to be the best it can be. What kind of economic, what kind of cultural circumstances can you create in a society that can allow human beings to flourish and develop their minds? So I've always had a pursuit for truth. I grew up without 2 pennies to my name here in the Bronx. Ever since my parents had divorced, I lived with my mother. And she and I, for a long time, rented just a room, and we would sleep in the same bed till I was about like 17 or so, when she could finally afford to have her own apartment.
Yay, mama. She did a good job, didn't she? Props to your mom, Jose, for kind of struggling through that and getting out of the poverty. That's terrific, isn't it?
Yeah, she was working 2 jobs pretty much all throughout I was going through high school. So I never saw her, really.
Wow.
But see, here's the thing. This is, I think, the part that really motivated me politically, is that when we actually were able to get our own apartment and we each had our own rooms, about a year later, we were living in a basement apartment. About a year later, the ceiling had collapsed in because sewage water had collected on the ceiling, and then it all just caved in and pooled. And so I called the local media. I called a lawyer who was able to work with me pro bono, which was great. Yeah. And then I went to my assemblyman's office, and at first he was helpful. But when I told him, listen, we're going to make sure that other people don't have this same treatment because this landlord owns lots of property here in this neighborhood. We can make sure that, because I brought him complaints of other people. He told me to actually drop it all. And I have all this documented. And he told me to drop it all. And he said, if somebody approached you with $15,000, would you take it and drop all of this? And I said, no, that's not even enough to move out. This is New York City. It's one of the most expensive places in the world.
Yeah.
So, he called my mother later that night and said, you need to drop this case because no one will rent to you ever again. Because it was my mother's name on the lease.
Wow.
And he said to my mother, and if your son keeps being a troublemaker like this, good luck finding a place in New York. And then mysteriously the next day, the super and the landlord changed the locks to the apartment. So
what?
And that's that's illegal here in New York State. You're supposed to get a 2-week notice, but because my mother didn't want to fight it, the police couldn't help me. So I saw right there, I didn't understand why the assemblyman and the chief of staff of his office were trying to bully me into submission to not raise a ruckus about this. And I think some reporter, and I guess, take this with a grain of salt, this is an allegation that the landlord was actually a big donor to a lot of the local politicians there, including the one I went to.
Well, sure. That's the American way, isn't it? So that's a really interesting story. And to me, it explains quite a lot about the next question I'm going to ask you, as someone who has become a vocal and vociferous critic of legacy media, right? So how do you connect the dots there between this grotesque experience of people living in a democratic country who have to live this way versus the America that is being reflected by legacy media, which is sort of not the same place, is it?
No, it's not. The way I connect these dots is simple. I mean, it's not just the Bronx or Detroit or these other places, because I actually got an opportunity to go to South Dakota to work on a congressional campaign in 2018. And I also saw, what the farmers were going through also. I see, and really I'm just fed up because you see a lot of these progressive, squad members in the Congress saying, we're going to shake things up, we're going to do things. And AOC was somebody I had reached out to actually for help because I was so desperate when she had won her primary against Joe Crowley. And I thought, okay, maybe this is somebody who's the real deal. Now, I never heard back from her office, but I still gave her the benefit of the doubt for a bit. But, legacy media is out here reporting that America's leading the way in the world with democracy and that we have the authority to lecture other countries about what is, quote, democracy and what is right and just. And meanwhile, the United States can't even take care of its own people. Right. And we're also leading the way in coups. That's all we do. We coup around the world. We dictate to other governments what they have to do, or we sanction them to hell and back. So it's horrible what we're actually doing versus what the media is reporting on. So to give the media a taste of its own medicine, I think it was inevitable. Somebody was going to do it if it wasn't me.
I love that the activism is now being pointed at legacy media, not just the power structures, but also at the pedestal holding up democracy that is not holding the power structures to account or even telling the truth. This is such pure, unadulterated, accurately pointed activism. I feel like it's a game changer. And I love it when I see you doing it. I will admit that. I love it when I see you doing it. I'm a former legacy investigative hotshot journalist myself. And I don't even believe what I'm seeing these days. So what you're doing is so great. And I just want to say one more thing, and then we'll get into the details of what you're doing and what we're seeing. But I don't know so much about you. I'm assuming that you're left progressive kind of thing, probably, right? I don't know much about LaRouche, but I'm sensing that you're more on the left, but than I am. But here's what's interesting about it: on all of these issues, people on the left and right of center or libertarian can agree we are not being served by legacy media, and I feel this is where we can also come together on this issue. Do you agree about that, Jose?
Well, I completely agree. And I think one of the great things about these interventions that I've been doing, whether it's on legacy media or on these Congress people or even State Department officials that I've called out, I got a lot of everything. I get libertarians who love it. I get communists who are fed up with the Democratic Party who love it. I get former Democrat insiders who reach out to me and say, hey, listen, I was a Democrat insider for blah, blah, blah. For X amount of years, and we loved it. And I get Republicans. I get all kinds of people who unite behind the truth. That's all it is, right? And I think right now more than ever, given the fact that the United States has just stepped into full-blown tyranny, I mean, this is what I tell people all the time. I say, listen, there are 435 congressional districts. Can we have one person in each district stand up and do what I just did, whether it's to their congressperson or whether there's some event with legacy media there or some State Department official? Can you stand up and actually take back your government? Because our government has been hijacked, to be quite honest with you. And it doesn't matter where you are in the political spectrum to see that. And I think that's what unites everyone. And that's how I've been able to kind of bring together this coalition of people who follow me now on social media to say, listen, it's like the American Revolution. All these gentlemen didn't agree with each other. Hamilton and Jefferson hated each other. but they were able to put aside their differences and say, okay, well, let's get the British out of here first, and then we can go back to arguing with each other and dueling each other and fighting each other, right? Yeah. And that's what we need to bring back right now. Put aside our petty differences, and you'll see more. There's more that unites us than divides us, and legacy media doesn't want us to see that.
Well, it's very interesting that we're having this discussion, Jose, the week that Tucker Carlson was fired or whatever actually happened. There's some dispute about what actually happened, but because you're a guy, I'm sure he would have had you on his show.
You want some insider scoop into that? Actually, I was reached out by a producer named Abby Grossberg. And okay. So yes. And but now you know what's going on with Abby Grossberg, right?
I do. I wrote a Substack about Abby Grossberg, so I know exactly what's going on with her. But you tell me what you're about to say. Yeah.
So she had DM'd me saying Tucker wanted her to reach out to me to get me on the show. I exchanged my number and she spoke to me on the phone, but I can't remember what it was I said that I know turned her off. And so all of a sudden I was supposed to come on the next day after, but then all of a sudden she said, actually, we can't do it this week. Sorry. Maybe next week. And I never heard back from her again.
See, you are a perfect Tucker guest. That's because you bridge the gap politically. You're doing guerrilla tactics against legacy media, who he's always shitting on, and rightly so, right? So that's really strange that even happened. What was the event? Was it about the AOC interruption that you did, or what was the catalyst for Ms. Grossberg reaching out?
I think it was the Hakeem Jeffries intervention that I did.
Oh, I didn't know about that one. Okay. Hakeem Jeffries is the guy who says that 5 police officers were killed on January 6th. That Hakeem Jeffries, right?
Yeah, he's the Democratic minority leader now. As Fox News put him, the new Nancy. I had just to catch you up, I had confronted Hakeem Jeffries at a he was speaking at some lecture hall. And I said to him, Ray McGovern had just testified in front of the UN Security Council on Seymour Hersh's Nord Stream bombing. Don't you think you should be looking into it? And don't you think the media should be reporting into it? And his answer was, well, thank you for the question. I've got no information to suggest that we had anything to do with Nord Stream. And I said, yeah, because Seymour Hersh says you weren't briefed on it, right? This was an executive action. And then Hakeem Jeffries responded by saying, I'm going to speak more generally in regards to Biden and his leadership in Ukraine. And then I interrupted him again and I said, we committed an act of war. What are you doing to hold Biden accountable? And then and then I said, no, and then I followed up and I said, listen, you're from Brooklyn, right? You recognize bullshit when you see it. And so do I. And this is bullshit right now. They take the mic from me. And then I say, that doesn't stop me. I walk a little closer to Hakeem Jeffries and I say, you can hear me right now. I want you to say something about the bombing. And then I just go on. And then he says, okay, here's what I'll say. And I say, yeah, say it. We're going to continue to support the people of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And I was just like, no, that's BS. Do not do that. You will kill us all. Yeah. And then he started saying, see, this is why, the world is in a battle between democracy and autocracy. And so then I said, okay, how about accountability, not airheadedness, or bridges, not bombs, conversation, not cremation, diplomacy, not destruction. You're going to get us killed. And I'm being told that. I'm telling him that as I'm getting dragged out by 4 different security guards. So that happened in February. And I think that's what Tucker wanted me on for, because Jesse Waters did a great segment called The Anti-War Movement has awoken from its sleep, and he played my intervention as an example of that.
Yeah, well, it's true, and I love to hear you in these videos talking about nuclear war. I mean, when almost at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, we were wondering why peace talks are a bad idea, why they don't want to stop the taking of life and the ruination of the country, and why are they picking a fight with a guy with nukes? Why are you doing this? It makes absolutely no sense. And I was running all these kind of "if you love this planet" clips from the movies and hiding under our desks as kids, in the nuclear rehearsals we used to do, and nobody was talking about it. Nobody was paying attention. So when I hear you doing these intervention things with powerful people who are asleep, it really rings a bell. I think it's exactly the right truth to be speaking right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, though, my goal isn't even to go after the legacy media and ridicule them. I mean, yes, that is my goal. That is what I'm doing. But it's to try and wake up people who are watching watching what I'm doing and get them to do the same thing. Yeah, I get told all the time, well, they're going to come after you. They're going to arrest you. It's like, okay, maybe so. But if 300 other people started doing this, they're not going to get all of us. Right. And what would happen if 300 people stood up here in the country and did what I did? And would that be an example of taking back, your government? I'll tell you this. AOC is so petrified of getting another town hall. She now makes her town halls virtual. They're virtual now.
What a coward she is. Oh, God. I mean, she's just the worst because she's really, really, really a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? That's who she is. So let's talk about who my listeners will have heard what happened recently. And I just want to set the stage. So you're in an auditorium, it's full, and there are executive editors there from all the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Reuters, all sitting on the stage like the big kind of smarty pantses that they are. And tell me what was the event, and what you did and what were you trying to achieve there, Jose?
Sure, no problem. So the name of the event was called Fault Lines Democracy, and it was part of a 2-day conference. So the day that I got there was the first day. And that composed of really big names because it started at 11 a.m. and it ended with their headline panel at 2:30. And the 11 a.m. panel had some pretty big names too, like Masha Gessen, who is, I think, a writer for The New Yorker, a super anti-Putin, pro-Ukrainian war nut job. So she's there. Other MSNBC talking heads are there, and see, here's the thing, right? The event is open to the public. It's free to register. Anybody can walk in. No security checks, really, just your name. And you're telling me they only brought 60 people to this event, to this whole conference? I mean, this is like the media. This is the head honchos of the New York Times, the LA Times. You're telling me they couldn't bring more people than that, especially to something that was free and open to the public? So I wanted to just highlight that.
But what does that say to you? I'm sorry, at what point are you trying to make by saying that people aren't interested or that nobody cares?
Nobody cares about these people anymore, clearly, because I heard about the event the morning of, and I thought I was thinking like, oh, this is going to be hard to do because it's going to be some big auditorium with like hundreds of people. And I've done interventions with auditorium fulls of people, so it's a little harder for them to hear you. But when I got there, I was like, this is a tiny room. So it's going to be easy for them to hear me. These are great conditions, but I was also taking account like nobody is here. Nobody cares about what they have to say, which is very telling on them and very telling on legacy media today.
Yeah, so let's set the scene. So there's 4 people on stage, and what exactly were they going to be talking about on that day? What was the focus of this deal they were involved in?
Yeah, so this panel started at 2:30, and the name of the panel was called Policy and the Press, right? And the subtitle was something like, what role does the press play in shaping U.S. policy today? Something like that. And I was in the audience for like about maybe 5-10 minutes, and the moderator, who is this guy named Joe Capehart or something Capehart.
Jonathan Capehart. He's an old Hillary Clinton acolyte. That's who he is.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And in his buttery smooth announcer voice, he asked them, so what do you think about the role of misinformation today? And I think the lady, Sally Busby, was talking about, or maybe it wasn't her, it was the other woman, but somebody was saying, well, we understand the role of misinformation today, and it's very dangerous. And so it's very important people continue to stick to our sources because we filter out a lot of disinformation and misinformation that gets spread around wide across the internet, and it's important that we keep an eye on where this information is coming from. And at that point, I was like, I'm not going to sit through an hour of this. So I just stood up. And that's why. And so I stand up and I say, oh, is this the lecture hall with Seymour Hersh? Because it's at Columbia, and it was in a lecture hall. And the look, now you can't really see this in the video too well, but the look that the panelists gave me was like open mouth, bug eyed, like, what is this kid for real? And I wanted to give off the impression at first that I did walk into the wrong class or something, and I was just being a goofball. Yeah. And then I said, yeah, Seymour Hersh, the guy who wrote the biggest story of the century. And that, I think, is where you unfold the events of the video. And I want to point out that Joe Kahn, the executive editor of the New York Times, the entire time has his head down, does not look at me at all, refuses to look at me.
Cowards.
Only takes a couple sips of water from time to time. But, yeah.
But what's interesting about what you just said is that I interviewed Seymour about his Nord Stream story for the show here. And he said, oh, I wouldn't even take that to the New York Times. They'd never publish that work from me. I mean, it's astonishing, right? He did this magnificent piece. No one can really quibble with it. I know there's some kind of deep state pushback against it, but it's ridiculous. And he wouldn't even go there. Doesn't even bother sending his work into these people anymore. He does it on Substack like the rest of us. Just shocking. So just that scene is really, I was watching it and I actually felt sick to my stomach because it's really an emperor's new clothes moment, isn't it? Everybody in that room on some level knew that you were telling the truth, and they were all cosplaying something for power, right? For the power structures that exist in Western governments right now. And that's why some of them I thought it looked to me like they were hanging their heads in shame, Jose.
That's exactly right. That's exactly the impression I got also, that they couldn't respond. And, you're right. It is an emperor has no clothes situation. And there are two quotes by Orwell that fit now that I'm kind of ashamed that they fit now. But what is it? Speaking truth is deceit, and an empire built from lies.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. Telling the truth. And then he has the other quote that says, speaking truth is considered a revolutionary act in times of deceit, or something like that. That's the other quote too, which now is true. And, people say, it's like 1984. We're getting to 1984. I happen to believe we've been like that for the last 20 years.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
I mean, I'm only 24 years old. So I was born into a time where 9/11 was just happening, right? So I'm only like 2-3 years old when 9/11 actually happens. So I'm not even conscious of the world until a few years later. And, I only know this surveillance state, Patriot Act level kind of monitoring of people. I don't know any other America that people who are older do know. And when I talk to people who are older than 30, they tell me, oh, yeah, man, things were way different, in that before 9/11 than they are now.
I often on this program, and I also wrote about this, I feel that the kind of the oldsters like myself have a real responsibility right now, because we do know what it used to be. And let's face it, media, even back in my day, had a lot of problems. But compared to what's happening right now, it was sort of keeping the world safe for democracy. In a sense, we did, around wars, media was always bad. Gulf of Tonkin, for instance, there's always a big lie that starts these conflicts, but it was nothing like is happening today. And I feel very strongly, Jose, that if people my age who know a different time and a different skill and approach journalism more objectively and fairly don't stand up and start talking about it, we are lost. And it's amazing that I didn't realize you were that young, but for someone your age to have such absolute clarity about what's happening it's a real gift, I think, to the country.
I appreciate that, but as always, my rallying cry is let's get other people to rally behind what I did and do what they did, do what I did, because look what happened. One video, right, that got what? Look, I've seen it. The one that we just did, that I just did with the press, I've seen it translated into French. Like they put subtitles on it: French, Spanish, Italian, Russian, And the AOC intervention, the original AOC intervention, got super big also, and that one got translated into like 7 different languages: Portuguese, also Chinese, also. I think I also saw it in German too. Right, the world, the international community, is starved for something truthful coming out of the United States, because governments around the world don't trust the United States, and they shouldn't. The people around the world don't trust the United States, and they shouldn't. So when they see a citizen standing up, right, that means something to them, because they're like, okay, well, at least the citizens aren't crazy. And I always let my international followers know, man, help is coming. What you're seeing is not America. I happen to actually love the ideals of the Constitution and also of the Declaration of Independence. And what we've had ever since 9/11, maybe even before 9/11, is not America, is not the United States. It's a hijacking of tyranny that has happened. Our entire Congress is bought and paid for. And one of the ways I know this, there's a 26-year-old congressman named Maxwell Frost who won his race on the gun control campaign. And he loves to say we shouldn't have violence, senseless violence. Our kids are dying. But when Matt Gaetz introduced a bill to get our troops out of Syria, where 90% of the people are poor, lots of kids are dying because of our military involvement there, what does this 26-year-old guy do? He votes to keep our troops in Syria.
I mean, it's just, yeah.
But
I know.
I don't think he's evil. I just think he's told what to vote on.
Yeah.
He doesn't know what he's voting on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really shocking. So I just want to go back to the event this was the Columbia Journalism School. And one of the things you did was you kind of said a litany of all the things that the media has gotten wrong over the years. Massive, massive things. I think, did you include Russiagate in that list? I think you did.
That was the one I said was really wrong.
Really wrong, yeah. And does anybody ever in the audience encourage you or come up to you later, unless you've been thrown out, I guess, to say thank you for doing that? Or is the secret kind of, or not the secret, but is the truth kind of managed still even during the event?
A couple times that I've done these, when I called Nancy Pelosi a sad old drunk and I stuck around after, I had a couple people come up to me and say, man, you really gave her hell, in a good way. I don't know, for that event though, no, because when you look at the median age there, it was maybe about anybody who was over like 65, 70.
Yeah.
And they were all insiders. They're all insiders. All of them are some kind of connected to the people on stage in one way or another.
Yeah.
Right. So they're all friends and their job is to boo and hiss me. So those people weren't going to do it. But I think what's very telling is the reaction that I'm getting. This thing has millions of views now, translated into different languages. So the American citizenry who are like messaging me, commenting, retweeting, replying, liking, are the people who are cheering me on. And that matters a lot more to me than the people in the room. Because I know the people in the room, the only people who come to these events are people who are like, as I put, elite assholes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I don't care what they have to say to me. I only care. And also, sometimes I don't blame them either. I do love my neighbor, and I'm not going to go after my neighbor for being brainwashed. It's not their fault that they happen to believe the things they do. And if they're not part of that active power structure, I can't hold them accountable for believing what they believe.
No, I understand, although I do, my patience is wearing a bit thin on some of that stuff. But do you have what is your plan? Like, how do you get in? How do you make sure people hear your voice? Is there someone there with you who is recording? How do you make these videos? What is the kind of technical side of doing that?
It's very simple, actually. I use just an iPhone to record my audio. If I'm with a friend, I'll tell my friend, try and sit somewhere in front of me and then just start recording, and then I will sync the audio and video afterwards. If you're by yourself, though, just stand up, point your camera at the people you're talking to, and be heard. Throw that javelin, and metaphorically, of course, a metaphorical javelin of your words. The hardest part of doing this is just standing up and breaking the social contract. You're not supposed to interrupt these kinds of events. That's why it feels weird to do it. But sometimes, the truth demands that you break social convention and you have to speak out.
Well, this is the thing. We did see, certainly during the World Economic Forum, people from up in Canada here, we have quite a conservative news organization called Rebel News. I don't love everything they do, but they did do some good stuff at WEF because they were door-stopping people like Albert Bourla of Pfizer and other huge people who aren't used to being held to account. So these, what we used to call in the business accountability interviews, nobody does them anymore. You're kind of jumping out of a potted palm at some person with a camera who's not expecting it because they won't give you an interview. So that happened at the World Economic Forum this year, and I was cheering for that. I thought, okay, this is good because what you're doing and what's happening now is that we have runaway tyranny in governments because they've now realized no one is going to publicly hold them to account. That's what's happening. No one is saying you lied about this or you shouldn't be doing that, unless doing so, helps the kind of ongoing elite narrative. Once government realized nobody was going to be holding them to account, the thing that you do and these jump interviews by feisty little indie media organizations become a real act of courage. And I'm all in for that. I used to make a fortune doing it for a show like 60 Minutes, and people liked it then. But I think that's what we've got to do, because the legacy media is not going to do that to people. They're just not, right? Unless it's, somebody they don't like Bobby Kennedy or whatever.
Yeah, and I think, it's very telling with Tucker getting fired, because he, as far as I know, was the only guy on mainstream press to actually bring on dissenting voices of the war. He got on Glenn Greenwald on as one of his last shows to tell his audience why they should support the Uhuru group. There's a group of socialists down in Florida who were arrested, supposedly for working with Russia or something, but really it was just them being critical of the war.
Yeah.
And
you mentioned them, just to say, you mentioned them at the end of this clip I just played, right? That they'd been arrested. Sorry, keep on going. Yeah.
Oh, no. Yeah. I mentioned them at the end, and Tucker says, listen, I probably don't believe anything those people believe. Does that mean they should go to jail? Of course not. And he says, my entire audience should be denouncing this. Oh, and Glenn Beck did the same thing too. He said, listen, the last thing I am is a socialist, but they should never be jailed for thinking, for being critical of this war. For anybody should be jailed for thinking what they believe. It's horrible. So, and Glenn Greenwald was able to do that. And so now that Tucker's out, I don't know anybody on mainstream media who's even being critical at all of anything going on. Yeah,
it was a sad day. I mean, it very, very interesting to me, as a former lefty, but also as a feminist, that Tucker, if you had a good idea, it didn't matter if you had other ideas he didn't agree with. You didn't have to fit into an informational silo in order for your views to have validity. For me, it was having Kara Dansky on, who's a very, very devout feminist on the trans stuff that's going on in schools. And he had on Naomi Wolf, also a feminist, to talk about the tyranny problems around some really, really COVIDian countries trying to go to zero COVID. So I was cheering. I thought, wow. I mean, these are people Tucker probably wouldn't socialize with. But he's an equal opportunity truth seeker, and that is what is to be admired. And you would conversely, on the other side, on MSNBC, Matt Taibbi, for instance, goes on there, and it's like a machine gun assassination attack, which, by the way, was debunked by Li Feng shortly after. But it's just, we just live in a world where we're in a lot of trouble on these informational issues, aren't we?
We sure are. I think. And now what? You're seeing another form of tyranny with this Restrict Act here in the United States, which they're saying they want to monitor all social media activity done by people to make sure they don't go on apps that were made in China or Russia or anybody deemed as an enemy of the state. Then you also have the media themselves, after these Pentagon leaks that came out just recently with this guy, this 21-year-old Air Force guy who leaked these documents onto Discord. They're asking the White House press secretary, well, what more is being done to make sure this never happens again? This was an outrage. And then they go on and report on those same leaks. I don't understand how a rational person could make heads or tails of what's going on in the world and think like, yeah, this is definitely a normal functioning government and society.
Yeah. I'm with you. It makes absolutely no sense. And not only did they rail against the leaker, unlike Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, along with Bellingcat, a Russia hoaxy organization, helped the FBI track this kid down so they could arrest him. I mean, I never heard of such a thing. It's just bizarre.
And what's horrible that the New York Times, working with Bellingcat, is going after whistleblowers, after leakers, and then the New York Times military advisor put out a tweet saying, "Hey, if that kid had come to us first, we would be trying to protect him." So what is going on here? And then Bellingcat tried to point to, well, this is different because the kid's 21 years old and he wanted to show off to his friends. Who cares?
Yeah, who cares?
Who cares? Like, it doesn't, the intention doesn't necessarily matter as long as the product, gives you, hey, more transparency. It taught us some things about this war. It taught us that the United States knows that Ukraine is actually fucked in this and that they have no way out. So, that guy should be praised as a hero, assuming he's not just some patsy who's been set up, and assuming he really did, do this, and this isn't all just some weird controlled psyop, because that's always possible also. But, you really won't know for a long time what the truth is with these leaks.
Yeah, very hard to, it's very hard to make. I feel sorry for people, to quote Rush Limbaugh, who I never thought I would quote ever in my life, but I'm a professional. I'm an information professional, and even I struggle. I mean, I spend all day, every day swimming through trying to figure out what is true, what isn't, what's a psyop, what's propaganda. I have my favorite people like Greenwald and Taibbi and David Zweig and Michael, all those guys are terrific. But outside of that, this is a really, really difficult time to actually know what's true and what's not true. And all you can do, I think, is your best and celebrate people like you. What's your next? Are you doing the White House press party?
I get told that all the time. If somebody wants to give me their press badge for the day and then get it revoked, I'd be happy to. But good luck trying to find somebody to do that. Those things are very controlled. Everybody, it's all scripted also, as we saw recently, and they only let a certain number of people into the room. And so, I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll see. I don't want to give them my ideas as to, maybe they're going to start putting a big poster of me at the White House press briefing, like, do not allow this guy to come in.
Yeah. You should make a little kit for people around the world who want to do this with instructions. I'm probably counseling an offense by doing this, but I don't care.
No, you'll be happy to know we do classes actually on intervention.
Get out.
And it's international. We've had people on from Canada. We've had people on from Australia, Japan, and I think now is probably the best time for a third class. We've had 2 so far, and they've been pretty good, pretty successful. We've been following up with people, kind of like there are some events coming up this week that some people are like trying to work up the courage to do, and where they're advising them and helping them in figuring out how to do it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and people can go on my Twitter, twitter.com/HoseBTrigga. That's JOSBTRIGGA, Hoseby, because Jose was taken. People can follow me there, and I will be posting updates for when the next class is.
Okay, and do me a favor and do follow Bill C-11, because this is Canada's terrible version of censorship, what they're portraying as being wrapped in a good idea. As Canada does, they say that this bill, which is going to seriously restrict digital content providers and try to shift some of our income back to legacy media here, which is a colossal failure right now. It's just awful, but it's censorship nevertheless. To have an unelected, the CRTC is going to be monitoring and advising and putting up, imagine guidelines around information. It's just absolutely disgusting. So if you ever have a chance to do a rant about Bill C-11, please do it, because we're really lost up here. We are, and it's because Canadians, I think we accept regulatory power, I think, because we think it's going to keep us safe, or it's patriotic to do so. We are a different kettle of fish up here. And we've had great moments in history where we supported, Vietnam draft dodgers and not POWs, but people who went AWOL even, and protected them. But those days are gone now. We're very, very rules based and guidelines based now, and we like it. And so, Bill C-11 is a nightmare for us. I'm quite upset today.
I'll definitely look into that, because we have our own version here of the Restrict Act. And what you were saying about, there was a time when Canada was protecting people in the Vietnam War who were draft dodgers or went AWOL. I think I feel the same way about my country too. There was a time when my country, was fighting in World War II, and FDR told Churchill to his face, when all is said and done, you're going to leave India, you're going to leave Africa, and we're not going to play this imperial game anymore. There was a time to be proud of your country, and now it's like Dante. In the beginning of Dante's Commedia, midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself astray, alone in a dark wood, for the straight path had been lost. Right, and all of us, especially us in Western countries, that are coming to fascism, might feel like, what happened? We were just on a straight and narrow path, and now we're in this dark wood. But like Dante, now we all have to make the trek through hell and purgatory, and we have to actually take back our government. And, yeah.
The road from hell is hard, right? What did Dante say about that? They had a great line about it. But we need to climb out of it, because what they are doing is they are hiding their bad, tyrannical ideas behind censorship, because they know that they will not withstand the sunlight of debate. That is what they are doing, and they know it, right? The more mainstream media says, we got to stop misinformation and disinformation in indie media, the more they are revealing that they have nothing to offer. People are peeling off because legacy media has nothing to offer. It has allied itself with the power structures in Western governments and ideology. And once that happens, you might as well just turn off the lights and go home, because you're not doing journalism anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I'm actually optimistic about the future, because even though we are on the verge of nuclear war and we are on the verge of World War III, truth always prevails. And I think, as the great Dr. King put it, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Yeah. And I happen to believe that. But only if citizens take up that mantle to allow justice to work through them. People often like to talk about divine intervention. Well, I don't know. Maybe I do believe in divine intervention. I think you are the divine intervention. If you allow yourself to be the instrument for it, you have to be in position to allow it to take over and be, the voice of reason. And I think everybody has the ability to do that if they just put themselves in the condition to allow it to happen.
I love that. And I will say that that's an important sentiment for our country to hear, Jose, because we did have our wonderful truckers and a legitimate protest, legitimate civil disobedience, gentle people, and they were crushed in the most obscene way, not just by this prime minister and the men in black police uniforms on horseback with truncheons. They were also crushed by the media, who told lies about them the whole time they were in Ottawa to please the prime minister. I guess I can't ascribe motivation, but I don't know why they did it. Everything they said turned out not to be true. So we, the people who supported the truckers, which is to say many of us, we saw it as a positive movement, are feeling, many people are feeling, what's the point? I'm sure that's why he did it. What's the point of protesting, right? So, and interestingly, the very people who were hating the truckers because they were blue collar workers are now in Ottawa demonstrating as a union because they want more money, and they've taken over the streets of Ottawa. So, those people have to realize that blue collar workers who don't live in Ottawa are their brothers and sisters, not the enemy. That's what they want. They want to divide us that way.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's why I'm very proud of my neighbors today. Nick Brana and I, at the People's Party, Nick has been able to get a coalition of people from the left and right. I mean, he made this rally called the Rage Against the War Machine rally back in February.
Yeah.
And he brought libertarians and communists together. I mean, two ends of the spectrum to come together against this war.
Yeah.
That is amazing right there alone. Yeah. And I think the population is now willing to hold their nose and say, all right, let's work together just to get the censorship out, just to get the tyranny out, and then we'll talk.
That's a wonderful sentiment. Well, let's leave it there. Jose, thanks for doing this. Keep on going. And I'll have you back. Maybe we can do something together at some point or spend more time. I really enjoy what you're doing. And now that my listeners have met you, I will try to incorporate more frequently your videos as you do these things.
Yeah, please do. You're welcome.
Because they're so fun. I love watching them cower in the face of your logic. It's great.
Yeah, I have a whole thread of these on Twitter. I've done this maybe like I said, maybe 14, 15, 16 times. So there are more videos. Some don't get as big as others because nobody knows who Masha Gessen is other than people in the corporate world.
Yeah.
So
it's something good that you are doing. So thanks so much for doing it, Jose. I'm very grateful to you. We'll see you soon.
Well, thank you kindly. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. So that was Jose Vega, who's a disruptor of BS. And I'm here for it. I'm here for it the way I was there for it when they were doing it at the World Economic Forum. Remember, they were confronting Albert Bourla, and it was wonderful. It was a sight to behold. Journalists used to do that. I used to do that back in the day instead of just taking dictation from the people in power because I'm making $2 million a year and I want to keep the money rolling in. So he's great. He's a lot of fun. And he did say he's on Twitter. He posts a lot of his stuff on Twitter. So I want to talk to you about two things here. One of them is I mentioned the lawfare. Lawfare is dangerous. I think they're using it against the truckers. And I know that there are going to be struggles paying their lawyers. So I know that Chris Barber, who I actually had a coffee with the other day, he's a lovely, lovely human being, talked to me about the law. There's a lawsuit. I believe it's a civil suit against them by some people in Ottawa or something for a huge amount of money. And so I will be at some point announcing on here a way to continue to fund the truckers if you're so inclined, because it didn't end for them when the convoy ended. Some of them are still struggling legally with this way that they do now of just drowning people in lawsuits that they have to defend or criminal actions that they have to defend. So I will be announcing something at some point soon, but don't forget them. Don't forget Chris and Tamara and the rest of them, what they did for us and how they're being persecuted. No question about that. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention to you before I say goodbye is the National Citizens Inquiry. You'll recall I was the official spokesman. Preston stepped aside and asked me if I would do it. And then I did it and realized it was too much work given my other responsibilities. So I passed it along. And they're doing wonderful stuff. It's really, really important. I think we're the only organization like this doing an inquiry maybe in the world. That's how I feel about it anyway. I'm not seeing other places are taking bites of it, but not one with this broad of a mandate. So they're doing important work, and you should be following them on the internet. They have a website, which is the National Citizens Inquiry.ca, I believe, or something like that. But that's not why I'm bringing them up. Well, I did bring them up before, too, to talk about Rodney Palmer's great work that he did on the CBC. But now this is something else, and it keeps the theme of our show going about media. They have been kicked off of YouTube. They were living a roundtable of people discussing various elements of the pandemic and pandemic policy and policy failures. And YouTube pulled the video within 2 hours of it going up. So what is going on here? I got a hold of the note that was sent from YouTube. 2 of 3 community guideline strikes. Your content was removed due to a violation of our community guidelines. You won't be able to do things like upload, post, or live stream for 2 weeks. If this happens again, just 1 more strike will result in the permanent removal of your channel. What is going on here? We can't live this way, right? This is way, way too dangerous. So I'm not sure there's anything we can do, but I do want you to think about them. Maybe go to the website and donate some money to them. And I don't know if they've got lawyers working on this or not. They probably do. I know how hard they work because they work so hard I had to step aside. But they do need our support. And it'll probably make you feel less hopeless if you're supporting the people who are actually trying to do something to save us from this. Now, I see that they're also carried on Rumble and Facebook and Twitter. I believe they do have an outlet, but, YouTube is where it's at still, sadly, although Rumble is bringing up the rear pretty quickly because of the free speech part of it. So do think about that. And with that, I will say to you, stay critical and see you.